there's the Josephus, this guy Josephus. He's a historian. And he's a Romano-Jewish historian. Okay, so to understand why, there's an interesting backstory here for this guy Josephus. And it's important for us to understand sort of what was going on in Israel and Rome at the time. Okay, so there's this general, Vespasian, and he is one of Emperor Nero's generals. And Emperor Nero fires him, and he becomes a beekeeper I think in Greece or something. Then there's this thing that happens in Israel where the Israelites, in I think around 70 AD, it's a couple of years before, they decide that they don't want to be part of the Roman Empire anymore and rebel. Okay? And this big rebellion. Okay? So it's shortly after, this is a well-known event, this Jewish rebellion, this Roman-Jewish war. And Josephus fought as a Jew for the Jews in this war. I think his dad was a Pharisee, actually. And he would have, our best idea for when Jesus would have died would have literally been the year he was born. Okay? He's a Jewish guy. So before the end of the war, in the middle of it, him and his troop, they get captured. I think they're in a hole in the ground, and they get found out, and the Romans are like, y'all got to come out of that hole. So then the Jews had a belief at that time that if you committed suicide, you would go to hell, or you would go to the bad place. Okay, they didn't use the word hell, but so Josephus is okay, everybody stab the person to their left, and that way, because they didn't want to undergo, the Romans probably would have tortured you and forced you to serve their gods or something, so they were avoiding that, or forced you to commit suicide. So I don't know, it's this big mathematical enigma. Somehow Josephus winds up being the last guy. He's all right, everybody stab the person to your left. And this big question in mathematics, it's called the Josephus problem. It's how did he mathematically predict that? He claims that it wasn't a trick. But somehow there's no one left to kill him. And he was supposed to be the last guy was going to have to kill himself. He was going to do that, for everyone else. But he didn't. He goes up to the Romans and he's like, everybody's dead. I'll just be Roman now. And he tells General Vespasian, he makes a prophecy and prophesies that Vespasian will become emperor. Okay? So, Vespasian likes this Josephus guy, keeps him as a slave. He's with Vespasian with this big battle, the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, major historical event. The Jews were kicked out of Rome shortly after 100 AD in the final revolt under Simon Bar Kokhba, who they said was the Messiah or whatever. But that came later. But the destruction of the temple is in 70 AD by the Romans. So because in Vespasian, Nero gets assassinated because nobody likes Nero, and Vespasian becomes emperor. He gets made emperor, and so the line of the dynasty that started with Julius and Augustus Caesar and the whole family bond of emperors ends with Nero. I forgot what they call it. The Octavian dynasty or whatever. I don't know. Because that's Augustus's other name. So anyway, Vespasian makes Josephus a big shot, and he converts to just being a Roman. So he's a Romano-Jewish. So that's sort of his backstory of where he's coming from. But he wrote this history of the Jews in 94 AD. Okay? And there's this passage that he writes where he writes about Jesus. Okay, it's clearly a Christian passage, which this Jewish turned pagan Roman guy would never write that Jesus, God raised him from the dead, proving that he was a mighty man of God. Okay, it's clearly Christian, and it's clearly a Christian interpolation. And experts debate this, and the experts are all over the place on this. There's no consensus at all remotely. So I'm not gonna, about is it all an interpolation, or was there some sort of historical core that we can pull out? They're all over the place. I think the correct view is probably that he is affirming for us that Jesus existed and was crucified. But the resurrection that he affirms and all that, that was probably interpolation. Okay, so the reason why I say that is we have the Christian writer Origen. So I know I said I would use only non-Christian sources, but we use Christian sources for a little bit. He is arguing with the anti-Christian Celsus in 248 AD in his writing Contra Celsum. And he says that Josephus has information about Jesus, but is not a Christian. That he has correct information about Jesus, but that Josephus himself is not a Christian. Okay, given that the text, as it comes to us today, says that, Jesus rose from the dead, that would make Josephus a Christian. So in 248 AD, it didn't say that. And so it appears that he gives us a window into that there's some sort of middle ground. There's correct information about Jesus, and at the bare minimum, the text, what Josephus says in the history of the Jews, is at least going to tell you that Jesus existed and was crucified. Okay? Alright, we have some letters back and forth between a governor of a province named Pliny and the Roman Emperor Trajan in 112 AD. Okay? And these letters back and forth provide a way for us. These become multiple independent sources, and we can cross-reference to see if they're talking about the same thing. And he's investigating Christians and trying to figure out what to do with them. The issue is that once Roman citizens convert to Christianity, Roman citizens have rights to as a Roman citizen, you have a right to a trial. Your accuser has to. You can't just be accused by, a person even in our world today. If someone is working undercover as a cop, or as an FBI agent or something, when you actually come to trial, you're not undercover anymore. They lay all the evidence and how it was gathered out on the table. All right, and the Romans had a similar idea. You can't just be accused of a crime if you're a Roman citizen by nobody, by a faceless person who is unnamed. You can't have secret police. The Nazis had secret police like that. Saddam Hussein had secret police like that. But in reality, in that the Romans didn't think that was okay for their citizens, which were basically the super rich and powerful people. But the rest of the non-Roman citizens, like Jesus would have been, as a Jew, then they don't count. They're not. They don't have the same rights or any rights really. You can just enslave them if you're rich. That was one of the issues with freeing slaves. If Christians would have freed their slaves in the Roman Empire, then somebody just would have re-enslaved the person. Okay. So because you just don't have rights. Okay, so there was an issue where people said that Christians were cannibals because we eat the body and blood of Jesus on Sunday, or at the Lord's Supper. And they are the Romans and the Greeks really hated cannibalism. They thought it was super immoral. So that was something that they couldn't tolerate. So anyway, Pliny writes to Trajan as far as how he's investigating this whole Christianity thing, because by this point they're having to have some sort of official policy on how to deal with Christians. Okay, and that's really what we have documented here. And he says Christians meet on a certain day, probably Sunday, and sing hymns to Christ as to a God. They take an oath to tell the truth and do no fraud. They separate and they meet again for a normal meal later, but they're not eating human flesh. In other writings, Pliny says that Christianity is an excessive and contagious superstition. Emperor Trajan responds and he says, just ignore Christians unless there's some sort of other problem that arises with them. And then if a person denies Christ and gives homage to Roman gods, then he should be pardoned. Do not allow charges to be made without an accuser present. And so this is the issue of like, the reason why they give you the opportunity to recant is you could have been falsely accused. So if you just say, I worship the Roman gods and I deny Christ, then that's good enough. You're not a Christian. And so you can see how the whole martyrdom thing works, comes to be a thing, okay? There's Serapion, who is a Syrian Stoic philosopher who mentions Jesus. We've got Lucian of Samosata, who from 118 AD, and he writes an anti-Christian satire, so it's like a funny writing. It's meant to be comedic. So, like, the genre is satire, which means it's not a historical account. It's not these official government letters between Pliny and Trajan about how to handle a legal problem. It's in a different genre. Satire, is like it's making fun of something in a witty, like, smart way. So we have to be very careful. But he does talk about Christianity. He says that Christians worship the man Jesus who was crucified for teaching the things they believe. They believe in their own immortality and have contempt for death that leads to voluntary devotion, which is common among them. In other words, they don't care anything about death. Okay? They believe they are all brothers. The idea of human equality is a Christian idea because Jesus taught it, and they hold property in common, which was a thing that the New Testament talks about how early Christians put all their money into one pot. Okay, so how much of this is true and how much of this is him putting them down? It doesn't sound like a satire to our ears, but like when he says that Christians believe all people are brothers, that would have sounded stupid to Roman ears because people obviously aren't equal, and people are different from different families. The Romans worshipped Emperor Augustus as a literal god, as a descendant of the gods, and they would make sacrifices to him at his temple with an idol for him. But, like, that didn't apply to every slave, Like, so they saw clear distinctions. People are not equal in their view. So, there's our little bevy of evidence for Jesus existing and being crucified. Okay, a little bit extra here that I got from Metatron. Is this YouTuber, but he's got some good stuff here. It's pretty straightforward on exactly when was Jesus born and when was Jesus crucified. So Matthew and Luke placed Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod the Great. Okay, Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So Jesus would have been born before 4 BC. Okay, not the other Herods that are his sons who took his name, but Herod the Great, which died in 4 BC. Okay, now Luke talks about this census. Okay, well the Romans conducted many such censuses. So that's no big deal that the Romans were conducting a census. The main point was to see how much money they could tax you for. It is debate. A lot of people challenge the idea that why would Mary and Joseph have to go to Bethlehem? And I think I don't know if they're trying to make a genre case that this is a myth because it's something that obviously is untrue. I don't know where they go with that. But like that part's weird. There is one explanation that I personally have thought of. There is evidence in the New Testament that Jesus was not poor. I don't know how rich, but like given that it says that his family went to Jerusalem every year at the Passover, in the story, I think it's the story where he's like 12 and he's with they go to Jerusalem for the Passover because it says they always do. That's something only rich people would have done. There's further evidence that Jesus opens the scroll of Isaiah to the place where it says and reads that Jesus knew how to read, so he would have had a little bit of an education. So maybe he wasn't that. He might have been a little bit better off than he wasn't at the bottom of the totem pole. Okay, financially. people get real offended by stuff like that, you know. I remember they have a bias, like you may have a bias to think that Jesus was super poor. But I mean, like what I'm saying is based on, well, stuff that actually is in the New Testament that it says about Jesus. So I remember one time there was a revival pastor who came to my church, and like traveling pastor guy, and he just got up there and said that one of the things he just all of a sudden decided to say in the middle of a sermon was that he hates these images of Jesus as weak on the cross. He said he would have been an all-American. Like his idea of Jesus was one who was real strong, physically strong, you know, buff, jacked. And it was like, well, we don't know that. But what we do know is that when he was dying on the cross, that was not his moment of physical strength and vitality. He was, you know, your body is broken, falling apart, you know, destroyed. Like, you're not strong. I don't know, but like, anyway, he had that bias that way, and some people may have a bias towards the idea that Jesus was poor and uneducated. But there's evidence that he had some education and that he wasn't poor. Okay, and just the fact that he had some education, it would be evidence that he wasn't poor. Okay, so anyway, birth of Jesus during the reign of Herod, so before 4 BC. Okay, the Gospels talk about this baptism of Jesus, and they say that shortly after he rebukes the salesmen, basically the money changers and everyone at the Jewish temple. So then there's an argument with the Jewish leaders at the Jewish temple, and we're told in the Gospels that they say it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will destroy it in 3 days. And it's like, okay, well there's a side point there. It's like, 46 years to, you know, okay, so the temple was built 46 years prior. Okay, so that may throw us off because it sounds like a 46-year building project, but like actually it means 46 years ago it was built. Okay. Josephus tells us that the temple was built in 20 BC. So Jesus would have been baptized in 26 BC at roughly the age of 32, which means his death would have been around 36, 37 BC. And Pilate was the 5th governor of Judea and served under Emperor Tiberius, Tiberius died in 37 AD. So therefore, things are lining up for when Jesus died. Jesus would have died right before, like, you know, since we've got an idea for when he was baptized in 26, you know, at age 32. We've only got a few years of, you know, of his public ministry, and he was condemned under Pilate. Well, that lines up with when other sources tell us Tiberius died 37 AD, which would have been the end of Pilate's run as governor. So like, okay, this all kind of fits. You know, Jesus died 36, 37 AD. Okay. So just a general idea. This gives us good evidence for like sort of a general time frame, sort of a foundation. Then we could say like, okay, well, then Jesus, you know, Corinthians is well known to have been written in 55. You know, near the deaths of Peter and Paul in Rome probably happened in 64. Okay, so we get some known data points, and then for other stuff that we're talking about, it's like, okay, we've got some things settled, and then we can kind of get an idea for like, you know, so if Jesus, you know, if we're off by like, you know, let's say it was 50 years prior to 37 AD, then, you know, 1 Corinthians would have been 70 years after the time of Jesus instead of, you know, less than 20. Okay, so that gives us an idea.